David Buss, thank you so much for joining us today. This is the
Wow.
25th anniversary of HBES, and it's a pleasure to be able to interview you for this project.
Hey, great to be talking to you.
Let's start with softball, so make sure we're all on the same page. And what discipline did you earn your doctorate, sir?
Personality psychology. And I went into personality psychology because I thought it was the discipline within psychology that was designed to think about grand theories of human behavior and human nature. And that's what I was interested in, what made people tick.
Gotcha. And how did you make that leap eventually to studying behavior from an evolutionary perspective, and what books and what people really prompted you to do so?
Well, it started when I was an undergraduate. So, embarrassingly enough, a very long time ago. So, 1975
Wow.
was like junior in college, and I wrote a term paper designed to upset my teacher. I was still in that kind of rebellious mode, and it was called Dominance/Access to Women, in which I proposed that the only reason that men wanted to become dominant, high in status, was so that they could gain sexual access to women. And I brought in different sources of evidence and some chimpanzee data and everything. And I didn't actually take it all that seriously, but my teacher really liked it, and so he wanted me to present it to the class. It was a small seminar, undergraduate, and so I presented it to the class, and the class really liked it and found it interesting. And so between that and then also I read a book, The Imperial Animal by Tiger and Fox, which was published in 1971, and is a wonderful, wonderful book. It's a little bit outmoded in terms of its evolutionary thinking, and that it's pre-Hamiltonian, but it's still a delightful book and a wonderful read. And so that's really what my first inspiration was. Although actually there was one before that. I first learned about the theory of evolution in an undergraduate geology class, and that blew me away because I'd heard the word evolution, but the whole notion that there existed theories to explain the origins of things was totally mind-blowing to me. I didn't know there existed, and that fascinated me. Theories of the origins of things. So stellar evolution, cosmology, and then of course organic evolution.
Wow.
So those are undergraduate. So from there I went to graduate school in personality psychology, UC Berkeley, and had this sort of there was no resonance at Berkeley. Let's put it this way,
Gotcha.
for this interest, and I didn't push it. But I started doing a little bit of research sort of not behind everyone's back, but just on my own.
Gotcha.
Designed to test this dominance/access to women hypothesis, which I think Dan Peruz later subsequently did. I mean, he totally independently.
Yes.
Thought kind of, in retrospect, it's sort of a simple-minded and kind of obvious sort of thing, but to the undergraduate mind, it seemed like an interesting idea.
Sure.
And so I collected some data on it. Never ended up publishing it at that time, but I did, as a graduate student. I wrote we had to write 3 papers on areas of interest, and one of the papers was called Evolution and Personality, in which and they allowed me to do that, and so but it wasn't until post PhD. So by then, I was basically at that point during graduate school. I was reading on evolution on the side. So I read E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology, which came out in '75. I read Dawkins' The Selfish Gene. But probably the book that influenced me the most was Don Simon's book, The Evolution of Human Sexuality, and so that, and then also I found Trivers, for the 100th anniversary of sexual selection theory, there was this volume that they did, and I found it in a used bookstore.
Wow.
And so I was reading through these chapters, and then I came across Trivers' chapter, and I went, whoa, this is like mind-blowing.
Yeah.
And so I started to think about ways in which I could actually test some of these ideas in my work. And so it was really, so now I got my PhD at Berkeley, now I'm at Harvard, assistant professor, 1981, and so I start designing some studies, again, just on the side,
Yes.
not as part of my main research program.
Harvard had no idea what they were getting into.
They had no idea. Yeah, and so that was kind of the start of my interest there, and I never dreamed, I always thought it would remain an avocation, an avocational interest. I never
Wow.
dreamed that it actually would totally take over my life and consume me and displace everything else, virtually everything else, professionally, and become what I did.
Wow.
So I never envisioned at that time. So, so did that answer your question?
Very much so. So aside from the books, I imagine that helped you to become evolutionized in your thinking. I imagine it was somewhat of an intellectually lonely time, or was it not? Were there any key supporters you had in the evolution of your thinking?
Well, yeah, there were. I mean, it was a lonely time, only in the sense that there was almost nobody else doing it.
Yes.
You know, there was no evolutionary psychology at that time, and I thought that I was working pretty much totally in a vacuum. But then I started, one of the biggest influences, I not only read Simon's, but I started corresponding with him.
What era are we talking here? Early 80s?
Yeah, early 80s, so 81, 82, 83,
Thank you.
in that range. And so that was very helpful. But otherwise, no one really knew what I was doing because I hadn't published anything
Gotcha.
really on it. And so I was continued to publish on mainstream personality stuff, and I got a lot of recognition for that. In fact, I won the early APA Career Award for my personality work, not for my evolution work. And so there's a weird way in which it was beneficial because from the field's perspective, I sort of made my bones,
Yes.
so to speak, in the mainstream. And so when I started doing the evolution work, they didn't view me as a crackpot,
Gotcha.
like they might have if I had just come out of nowhere.
Well, on a similar note, we just interviewed Lita Kosmides and John Tooby yesterday, and it seems to me they were essentially the Jackie Robinsons of evolutionary psychology, in which that they were the first people hired as out-of-the-closet evolutionary psychologists. They didn't build up any street cred in another discipline as you
Right.
did first.
Right.
In fact, she tells a story of how she was at Harvard as a graduate student and had heard from others that there was this young professor who she didn't know about who was starting to talk about evolution in his classes. Turns out it was you, and there's some sort of story how she comes to your office door. And why don't you pick it up from there?
Right, yeah. So, well, what happened was I found out later. Yeah, I was teaching a course in human motivation, and I organized the course around evolution, basically. And she, I guess, heard that, and so she came knocking at my door, and I invited her in, and we started chatting. And I can't remember what happened, but we got into a disagreement like right away. So that was kind of the start of things there, and it was a wonderful introduction. Then she introduced me to John Tooby, and then they introduced me to Irv DeVore, and so I would occasionally go with them to Irv DeVore's what he called simian seminars, which was a lot of fun. And so I had some contact with Lita and John then, and we became friends. But I don't think there was a lot of contact. It was more, they. This is an ancient memory
Please.
here. So, but a couple of things. One is that I remember John gave me a paper of his, a draft that he was submitting for some contest, and it was on his parasite theory of
Sure.
the evolution of sex, which I later found out was published in the early '80s. More or less simultaneously and independently with Hamilton's theory of the evolution of sex. And I asked Hamilton once about it. I said, Tooby's theory and your theory very similar. What is there a difference, or what's the deal? And he said, yeah, they're basically they differ in a curlicue here or there, but they're basically the same theory. And to me, it kind of blew my mind because Hamilton's a genius,
Yes.
And so, and I think Tooby is a genius as well, coming up with theories like that Hamilton's coming up with as a graduate student.
Yes.
So that was kind of cool. So I had some contact with Lita and John then, some intellectual contact and friendship contact, and then I maintained contact with them after I left Harvard and went to Michigan, and so I kept tabs. Lita got her degree, I think it was '85.
Yep.
And on her work on cheater detection, social exchange, and so I kept up with them. And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but I'll just tell the story. So I got elected to be a fellow at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And when you get elected to be a fellow, they don't assign you to a year. You're a fellow, and then you can choose what year you want to be there. You also have an option of writing a proposal to invite other people to be there with you. And so I decided to write a proposal called Foundations for Evolutionary Psychology. And I think I wrote this like in 1987. And of course, the people I thought of immediately were Lita and John, Martin and Margot, who I also met at Harvard when they did a sabbatical year at Harvard, Don Simons, and
Daly and Wilson, I believe.
Yeah, I thought I said
sorry?
that. Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, and it was very strategic in the way that I wrote this, because the then director of the center was a guy named Gardner Lindsay, who had written his AP. He was president of APA at one point. Had written an American Psychologist paper in his presidential address on the evolution of incest, and so he had was an early believer in the importance of evolutionary theory, and so that appealed to him, and I think that's probably why the proposal got accepted. Weirdly, well, anyway, so the proposal got accepted. I proposed that Lita be co-director with me of this thing. I mean, in reality, there were no directors, but it was a very cool thing. So we ended up spending more or less a year at the center, and met all the time, met every day for lunch, and had weekly meetings with them. Basically, Martin, Margot, and John and Lita and me, and then occasional other people around. It was a very very stimulating time. So how did I get off on that?
No, we're talking about the evolution of your ideas and your supporters. And
Yeah.
Any other stories you can share with us about Lita and John during your time at Harvard?
Yeah, I'll just mention a couple.
Please.
One is that that I think that I recognized, even though they were just graduate students, and going back to the first argument that I had with Lita, I recognized that they were both brilliant, and that even though they were totally unrecognized at the time, and no one or few other people realized how brilliant they were, I recognized that they were brilliant and were going to really revolutionize things early on. And so, so I was very happy to, become friends with them, and subsequently get them invited to the center, and subsequently also invited them to write this brilliant article on personality and individual differences for the special issue I edited in 1990 in Journal of Personality. So it's just been a special treat. The other sort of anecdote is that at the time, I was in a junior, young assistant professor at Harvard. They're young graduate students, but they've apparently always been on a night schedule. And I started waking up later and later and later in the day, and started going into the office later and later and later in the day. Got to the point where I was like going into the office around 5 p.m.
Wow.
And I remember once going into the office, and like now it's like 2 in the morning. So I'm on this very late schedule. 2 in the morning, I'm in there totally alone. There's a knock on the door. It's Lita and John. They're just coming into work.
That's great.
So, so it's kind of funny. I don't know if they've maintained that night schedule, but anyway, so that was all good fun. I guess the other thing is the interactions between Lita and John, watching the interactions, because like I remember once sitting in a restaurant with them, and John was developing or just speculating about a hypothesis he had about the evolution of the shape of the male penis.
Mm-hmm.
And this was like way before any of the sperm competition work came out and everything. And I remember Lita looking at him, and we're in like a group of about 6 people, and Lita turns to him and said, "John, that is just so stupid." And I remember thinking, now John is like one of the most brilliant people I know, and Lita's calling him just stupid. So I don't know, their interactions are always kind of fun.
And I'm hoping they have a plenary this year, and I'm hoping they'll have that interaction on stage again. It's always a treat.
Yeah.
When I was chatting with them yesterday and interviewing them, they mentioned the tremendous obstacles they had early on, in particular because they were just grad students. They were on the market for 4 or 5 years.
Right.
You were well established, of course, by the time you became evolutionized, but you surely faced plenty of obstacles yourself.
Yeah, I think probably fewer than they did because I got hired away from Harvard by Michigan with tenure after 4 years, and this was right at the cusp of my, total transformation, to becoming an evolutionary psychologist. So we're talking around 1985, and had Michigan known at the time that I was going to be as full blown an evolutionary psychologist, I don't know if they would have hired me. But they were aware of my evolutionary interests, and in my job interview, they introduced me to people like Richard Wrangham and Barb Smuts and Randy Nesse and other people who were there at Michigan at the time. And the fact that there were so many evolutionary people at Michigan was a big draw for me to go there. But I think I was, as it wasn't, I didn't plan it this way, but it was fortunate that I got tenure before my evolutionary stuff really started to come out. And so I didn't really face those sorts of obstacles that Lita and John did, at least in terms of getting a job and getting well, of course, once they got a job, tenure was an inevitability.
Was your job talk evolutionary oriented?
No. It was I want to say mainstream personality stuff, but it was interesting personality work. Let's put it that way.
Sure. As one of your former graduate students, I have my own favorite papers of yours and thoughts about which ones have had the best impact on the field. What are yours?
Well, what are yours?
Well, 92 jealousy paper, of course. I've done a couple of publications on jealousy. When I first read it as an undergrad, I was blown away by it. I then went deeper into longer papers like your BBS 89 paper on preferences across cultures. Those are the two that jump out at me. And of course, evolutionary psychology as a meta theory, your 95 paper was huge for me.
Right.
So those are the ones that jump out for me. How about for you? Which are the ones you think have had the biggest impacts?
Well, those have had big impacts. I would say the Psych Review Sexual Strategies Theory paper has, at least judging by citation counts, I think that is my most cited individual paper with Schmidt, co-author with Schmidt, and that was kind of a good opportunity. And I was really glad that it got published in such a good journal and had such a big impact. And people are still trying to refute it today. But that's, I mean, it was never meant to be a final theory, in the sense that even in the discussion we said here are ways in which it's incomplete, and we need to go in the direction of understanding individual differences, various elements of context specificity that we didn't talk about and so forth. But to this day, it amazes me, just to give one example, that there are people still trying to disprove the notion that men and women differ in desire for sexual variety. Shows like about the largest effect size that you will ever see in psychology. Magnitudes of effect of like 0.8, 1.0, 1.2 for sex differences in desire for sexual variety. And, I mean, you'd have to almost not be a living human being to know that there aren't these sex differences there. But nonetheless, so people have tried to chip away at various aspects of that, but I think largely unsuccessfully. But so that paper, I mean, I have some personal favorites. So like I like my my derogation of competitors study.
Lisa Deaton?
Lisa Deaton, yeah, 1990, and that was kind of cool, and that was influenced by Dawkins. Dawkins and Krebs, and Dawkins published a couple papers in the 1970s titled something like "Animal Signals as Manipulation Rather Than Information," or something like that, and where basically they argued that animal signals are designed to persuade and influence and manipulate, rather than simply veridically communicate information.
Sure.
And so that was kind of influential, and so that led to that paper, the derogation of competitors. Although weirdly, the derogation of competitors, there's an interesting story behind that, and that is, and Randy Thornhill, by the way, I should mention, is another influence, and this will bear into this particular story. Early on, I read when I was at Harvard, I spent most of my time reading not in psychology but in evolutionary biology because I had absolutely no training, and so basically I had to learn everything from scratch. One of the books that I read was a book by Rainey Thornhill and John Alcock called The Evolution of Insect Mating Systems, 1983. And it was a fascinating book, and I came across this section called Insect Mate Guarding Tactics or something, and they developed this kind of a taxonomy of insect mate guarding where insects build a fence around the female. They emit chemicals that disguise the sexual attractant signals of the females. They grab the female and get her away from the other males. They jostle, so there were all these things, and I thought, humans kind of do that too. And so that led to this tactics of mate retention, as I called it, and I developed a kind of the human taxonomy of tactics of mate retention. But one of the things that came out of that was one of the tactics was derogation of competitors, where one tactic of mate retention is like, let's say you're trying to, hit up on my partner. I tell my partner, listen, Barry, he's really a loser. Do you know that he's going nowhere? Do you see that car he drives? Plus he's, his character's a little sketchy.
It's going a little too far, but continue.
Okay. So, but anyway, so I decided the derogation of competitors tactic was so interesting within the context of mate retention that I decided to take that and build that into a different research project, and with being fed by those Dawkins-Krebs papers on animal signals. So that's one that was kind of cool, and I guess that's got some attention, but I guess there's this whole literature now on gossip, but a lot of it doesn't refer back to that because I didn't use the word gossip.
I see.
So, but that's in essence what it is. It's one form of gossip.
One of the big early papers in EvPsych with regards to human mating was that 89 BBS paper on sex differences and mate preferences across cultures. Can you tell me a little bit more about what led you to do that study, how difficult it was to do pre-internet, and I remember you telling me about querying others about the likelihood of finding such cross-cultural differences.
Yes. Well, that was really the first research project that I did, and that was stimulated by both Don Simon's book, The Evolution of Human Sexuality, and Triver's paper. So that basically there were these sex differences that were predicted more or less straightforwardly by, I should say also George Williams wrote a book called Sex and Evolution, 1975, that was also pivotal. And so what I did is I was doing a study of married couples, and so I included in it to test these hypotheses just for my own sake. I never intended to publish them, just to see if there were the sex differences that were predicted. And so when I analyzed the data, it turned out they were. And I thought, this is interesting, but if these are evolved sex differences, of course, no one's going to believe that they're evolved based on a sample of Cambridge couples. And so at the time, I got invited to give a talk at a conference in Germany. And so I went and gave a talk in Germany. And so I was talking to the organizer and telling him about these findings. And he said, and I asked him if he'd be interested in doing an analogous test in Germany. And so he did, and about 2 weeks later, I got this stack of, questionnaires that were from Germany, and like this massive sample of Germans. And so analyzed that data, they came out, but I basically decided that no one was going to believe that there were these evolved sex differences unless I really did a massive cross-cultural project. So I launched that. And so as I was launching that, though, I went around and I talked to, at Harvard, different people. I talked to sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists, biologists, and said, I found these sex differences here in these Cambridge couples. Do you think that they're going to be universal or restricted to Western cultures or whatever? Almost all of them said they thought, no, they're not going to be universal. They're just limited to Western cultures. And the only exceptions were evolution-minded people like Don Simons, who did expect them to be universal. And it's one of these things that I regret that I didn't get these people to write down their predictions and sign them before I collected the data. But when the findings came in, I was somewhat surprised that they were as universal as they were.
37 cultures, 10,047 participants later, universality.
Right. And so basically it took about 4 or 5 years to do this, and again it was almost like in the background, but I knew it would probably make a splash, because it went so much against the grain of the mainstream. Just to give you an example, one of my mentors was a woman at Berkeley named Jean Block, and her whole theory was that if there were any sex differences, they were totally a result of socialization. Dressing girls as pink and boys as blue, boys in blue, and she even made a science documentary called "The Pinks and the Blues." And so the notion that there were evolved sex differences was totally anathema to her, and so the context in which I was socialized in psychology was very much a blank slate context in psychology, and the notion that there were evolved sex differences, nobody thought there were evolved sex differences then. Some people still don't think there are evolved sex differences. So that's the story of that paper, I guess. It was logistically somewhat difficult. So there were things like what I would have to do is, this was pre-internet, so I would at the time I published an article, my first paper on mating, and it got published in American Scientist, which is a prestigious place to publish, and what happened was that got international coverage, and so I started getting what they used to do is send postcards requesting a reprint, and so I started getting these postcards from all over the world requesting reprints. So whenever I would get one from a country that I didn't have, I would write back and say, "Hi, I'm doing this cross-cultural. Would you represent your country in this cross-cultural project?" And so one country after another, I built this network. But so at the time, this was prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, changing so there were these Eastern Bloc countries that were very heavily under communist rule, and so I remember corresponding with one collaborator, and she said, "Very excited, about this, and we'll start data collection immediately." Another letter 6 months later saying, "Have collected data for all the males. I'm about to start with the females." 6 months later, she said, "I apologize, but I'm unable to collect any data." Boom! I was like, Iron Curtain came down, and I never found out what happened. Other things, like I got some of my African collaborators wrote back and said, you want me to ask what men want in a wife? He said, "Well, we have," he didn't say it exactly like this, but "we have polygyny. So do you mean what I want in a first wife? What do I want in a second wife, or a third wife? Because that makes a difference." And so there were interesting things that at the time my collaborators would send me newspaper clippings of, there was an interesting twist in South Africa where they had two different laws for whites and blacks, and one of them for blacks, if I remember correctly, blacks were allowed to marry up to 4 wives, but whites were restricted to 1, and so there was a movement by whites on for equal rights for whites.
Wow!
So it was an unusual, it was an eye-opening thing to do this cross-cultural research anyway.
Wow. Shifting gears slightly, any paper you think been relatively orphaned, that's been overlooked and hasn't had the impact thus far that you thought it would?
I guess, the derogation of competitors one, I think, there's a lot more gold to be had in that vein. There's one that I wrote with Marty Hazelton on deception between the sexes that hasn't had as much of an impact as I expected. And I guess I would say the whole area of conflict between the sexes.
Strategic interference paper?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of gold to be had in studying conflict between the sexes. And I'll mention one other, and this is probably one of these strategic or sociological things, that is to get things to be influential. you need things. There are so many thousands and millions of papers published nowadays that you need to have a good title. You need to have things that make it stand out. And so one of the things that I did is I published a paper that included a section on the evolution of patriarchy, where I developed what I think is a novel theory of the evolution of what's called patriarchy. Now, of course, patriarchy is one of those terms that different people mean different things, and no one really knows quite what they're talking about, what it means. But what I did is I narrowed it down to the notion that one aspect of which is males control resources more than females. So why would that be? And so my theory was, well, you have basically the coevolution of female preferences for males with resources, and the coevolution of male strategies to acquire the resources. And so you have this coevolution of female preferences and male mating strategies that combined explain why men place a greater motivational priority on resource acquisition, why they are willing to sacrifice their grandmothers, their children, their whatever to claw their way up the status hierarchy, and does invoke females, women, as part of the causal chain in why men have resources. And so I thought this would provoke an avalanche or outbreak. It's like, not only do men have more resources, now you're blaming women for why they have more resources. But to my surprise, what I should have done is just made that a separate paper, and called it something like the evolutionary origins of patriarchy. And I may still do that to resurrect that, but I would have thought that might generate some interest, but that hasn't. So I guess that would be an orphan piece of a paper.
Sure. Step back to grad school. I'm hoping several of today's grad students end up watching this. And I'm sure, like many of them probably struggle a bit. And I'm wondering if you did, and if you had a chance, what would you tell your fledgling self back in the day if you had the opportunity?
Well, I would tell my fledgling self, first of all, life is short, so you have to do what you really want to do. So a lot of people, I don't know, they devote their lives to studying, what sometimes in psychology used to be derogatorily referred to as the 2-point threshold of a rat's ass psychology. And what that meant is they literally studied rats in Skinner boxes, and if the rat shit twice, then that would somehow be an important dependent variable of some kind or other. But a lot of psychologists do devote their lives to studying things that I think are relatively trivial, and to me, life is too short for that. And so I would recommend to graduate students, devote your life to something that you really are interested in, something that's important. Not just something that in maybe the short run will get you ahead. It is a tough and competitive world we live in. But the other thing is, and this is I'll tell maybe a story about Hamilton.
Please.
And this is another piece of advice. Evolutionary psychology, evolutionists, as you know, are sometimes accused of telling just so stories.
I've heard
This
this.
is a meme that I think Stephen Jay Gould invented, and somehow it caught on. And Hamilton, back when he was, I think, first president of HBS, gave his presidential whatever, and he said he thought there should be an award for the best just so story hypothesis of period. And what he was saying is, well, another term for just so story is hypothesis. And he thought that the farther out the better. Why shouldn't creativity in hypothesis generation be encouraged? Why should it be discouraged? And so I agree with Hamilton. So things that we know now in a factual or scientific sense would have been viewed as science fiction 20 years ago. So like some of the
sperm competition,
or I think of like David Haig's work on mother-fetus conflict. This would have seemed just totally outlandish. But in a way, you could have said, someone could have said, well, this is just a just so story. It's a wild speculation or whatever. But in fact, it was a principled derived from basic first principles of evolutionary biology kind of thing. But so I think that I would encourage graduate students. Of course, you have to be prudent. So it's like when I tell my graduate students, as a graduate student, you don't want to start a 20-year longitudinal project where you won't be reaping the benefits for a long time. So similarly, you have to be very judicious in your selection of projects, but at least select those that are interesting.
And be bold.
Yeah, be bold.
I'm with you. Return to HBES itself. As you know, this is the 25th anniversary of the first HBES in '89 at Northwestern. I was wondering what kind of contributions you made to the formation of HBES, how long you've been attending, those types of things.
Well, I've been attending since the very beginning. So HBES, before it became HBES, there were groups at Michigan and Northwestern, and they used to go back and forth and meet every other year, and there was no official society. And so I got to Michigan in '85. First HBES was '89, I believe.
Yep.
Is that correct? And so around, what happened was it started to grow, and we would meet every year. So I remember 1986, 3 years prior to the formation of HBES, we had a big meeting in Ann Arbor, and there was George Williams and Hamilton and Alexander and Martin Daly, and there was just like this all-star lineup. I actually chaired a symposium with all those people in it, and I was like mind-blowing. I actually have a videotape of that, by the way, so I have to dig out.
That'd be
like
great for us here.
Great archival record, but it grew to the point where we started talking. At that point at Michigan, there was a thing called the Evolution in Human Behavior Group. It was me, Richard Wrangham, Randy Nesse, Bobby Lowe, Barb Smuts, Warren Holmes, and a couple other people that I'm missing. Kim Hill came, and so we started talking about forming an organization, and I think that Randy Nesse was critical in that. I think he's the one who really took the ball and ran with it. So I think my contribution was simply sort of being part of HBES before it was HBES, and also trying to put evolutionary hypotheses on to ground them in empirical research. So that was really what my goal was. I was trained as an empirical scientist, and I think I got pretty good training in that. And so I knew what all these accusations were about evolutionary, just so stories, and so I wanted to see, okay, to turn it into an empirical science, we need to do a lot of empirical research, and so that's where my focus was. And so if I were to say what my contribution was at that time, it would be just publishing empirical pieces that showed, hey, these aren't just so stories. There's some scientific merit to them.
Anything that surprised you over the quarter century that HBES has been around, and either the evolution of the conference or HBESers in general?
Well, I guess I've been overall pleasantly surprised. I mean, of course, I'm always impatient, so I want it to be larger and to have exploded more than it has. But I have been pleasantly surprised by all the interesting different directions it's gone into. So, like just before I came here, I was talking to a political scientist who's here and doing some fascinating work. And in my view, all sciences, all social sciences, really are have evolutionary psychology as their foundation, because just syllogistically, all behavior is a function of our evolved psychological mechanisms, and our evolved psychological mechanisms are a function of evolution by selection. And so, all human behavior has to ultimately be explained by evolution
all the way down.
Evolution all the way down, and evolutionary psychology in particular, because these things don't just go from magically; they go through a psychological system housed in the brain. So I think ultimately, political science, economics, sociology, anthropology, all these fields ultimately will be anchored in evolutionary psychology, not just what's called evolutionary psychology, and that's starting to happen. Seeing applied evolutionary psychology going out into evolution in the law, evolution in marketing and business, so many different realms and applications, evolution in political science. And so it really is starting to mushroom, and the ideas are gaining traction. So I'm very happy with all those developments. I just wish it would happen faster. That's my
Beyond faster and beyond more mushrooming and more tentacles elsewhere. Any other directions you'd like to see HBES or HBESers go in the future?
None that I can really think of. I mean, I just as a personal anecdote, sometimes people from the outside say, they have the stereotype that evolutionary psychology is all about mating and violence.
Sure.
This is a criticism that I get. Well, I happen to study mating and violence. I study mating and murder. And so, but in fact, there's evolution of cooperation, evolution of altruism, evolution of all kinds of things. And somehow, so the stereotype is a bit erroneous. But if you're going to pick two topics, mating and murder, mating and violence are close to what I call the engine of the evolutionary process, which is a differential reproductive success. And so, you don't mate, you don't reproduce, and your genes basically bite the evolutionary dust. And so mating is an extraordinarily important topic, and I think it's not just sort of boy meets girl kind of thing. It expands into everything,
Sure.
ranging from why people are so motivated to get ahead in the status hierarchy, why people form friendships, why they keep their kin close. Those to prevent, say, intimate partner violence is a protection tactic. So there's so many things that relate to mating, and so mating is not a narrow topic
Sure.
at all. But I think that there's one way in which the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, has been picked, and so now the field is digging deeper and deeper and deeper and getting into more interesting and less readily observable
Sure.
sorts of things that are deeper in the human mind and less obvious. So to me, it's an exciting time, and I don't think there's any sign of diminution. I mean, it's even in the mating domain. The field keeps new discoveries keep occurring monthly. So I'm very happy, and I think in the long run, there's no doubt about where things are going.
Sure.
There's no 100 years from now, people won't look back and say, "Oh, this evolution stuff, it was kind of like phrenology. It was an interesting idea, faddish idea, but turned out to be all wrong. So now we can go back to the blank slate." No, that's not going to happen. There's only one direction it can go. As Lita once told me, she said at some point in the future there will be no such thing as evolutionary psychology. We'll delete the word evolution. There will just be psychology because it will all be evolutionary.
Well said. I want to tell you a little bit about how we got this project started. So at last HBES in New Mexico, Catherine Salmon and I were sitting on a rooftop bar and just reflecting on some of the people who are no longer with us. For example, her former graduate mentor, Marco Wilson, and of course people like Bill Hamilton, David Rowe, Linda Muley, Deb Singh, one of your former colleagues, George Williams, of course. Many of today's current students are never going to have the opportunity to meet them in person, to see what they're like personality-wise, behavior-wise. So what can you tell us about them, some anecdotes that you're not going to get from the written word?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I was very privileged to have interacted with all those people in various ways. So let's see if I can come up with a couple. Well, one I've already mentioned about Hamilton.
Sure.
His advocacy of giving an award for the best just so story hypothesis, which HBES hasn't done yet. So I think maybe we should do that.
Sure.
Put it on the docket as an agenda item, added to the other awards. So that would be a good way of honoring
Sure.
Hamilton, I think. He was an absolutely amazing guy who was always thinking about. Still when he died, he was in Africa testing a hypothesis of his about the origins of the virus that leads to AIDS, and just an enormously creative guy. And I remember the first time I met him was in 1986, and he was coming to Austin for the pre-HBES thing before HBES was HBES, and I think Bobby Lowe brought him to my house. I held a party, and I was all like, Bill Hamilton was at my front door. I almost fell off my chair, because it's almost like meeting God, So that was fun. He was a genuinely humble guy, introverted, knew his importance, but was always I remember so he's in my house, and and I'm talking to him about, parasites and something. He said, "Well, what do you think, David?" Bill Hamilton's asking me what I think. I mean, he wasn't like one of these arrogant guys who just wanted to talk. He was actually interested in ideas and interested in talking with you. So that was so that's Hamilton. Who else is on our list here?
Oh, Dev Singh, of course.
Dev Singh. Okay, Dev Singh actually was my first undergraduate teacher.
Fascinating.
I took Intro to Psych with him, long before he was evolutionary. He was a physiological psychologist, taught physiological psychology, did research on nothing evolutionary, but he was kind of like a family friend, and so he and I kind of stayed in touch. And so in his class on either human motivation or human sexuality, he started assigning one of my first publications on the evolution of mate preferences, and in that I had what's called a Brunswick lens diagram, where it's basically a graphical depiction of the evolutionary theory of female beauty. So down the spine are observable cues: full lips, sprightly gait, lustrous hair, good skin tone, etc. And then reproductive value, and then attractiveness. And the logic is that our standards of attractiveness should evolve to embody those cues that are reliably associated over evolutionary time with reproductive value. And so Dev Singh, in assigning this chapter, looked at this graph and he thought, "Oh, that David, he is so stupid. He has missed the most important cue to female attractiveness in the world: waist to hip ratio." And so he, being very familiar with the weight and obesity literature, started doing research on waist hip ratio. And I think it was spurred by this observation about how stupid I was to omit this most important cue. And so that's Dev Singh. So who else is on?
George Williams.
George Williams. George Williams. I remember talking with him at an HBES conference. This is one of the wonderful things about HBES, is that you get to talk to all these interesting people. And George Williams, I mean, I had read his book Adaptation and Natural Selection, 1966. Absolutely brilliant book, and in which he caused the demise of the then what was viewed as group selection. And so I asked him once, D.S. Wilson was starting to get a lot of attention for trying to resurrect group selection. And so, and George is one of these guys, he's got, had, in my view, just impeccable judgment and the ability to just see through all the morass and clouds, just to see to the heart of conceptual issues. And so I asked him, do you think that humans are a group selected species, or what are your thoughts on D.S. Wilson's arguments about resurrecting group selection? And he basically said he thought that the arguments in his book were still valid and largely untouched, but he said that he thought maybe 99% of human adaptations were through the standard process, and that maybe we had 1% group selected adaptations. And so that was his view. So I don't know what view he would hold now, but
how about Dave Rowe?
Dave Rowe, I had most of my contact with David Rowe was drinking beer and having fun. So we didn't talk too much psychology, but he was a classy guy who was one of the very few. One of the things I admired him is he was trained by Robert Plomin, an eminent behavioral geneticist. And behavioral geneticists, you'd think that evolutionary biology and behavioral genetics, or evolutionary psych and behavioral genetics, would talk to each other a lot. But in fact, they've evolved as these two separate disciplines. David Rowe was one of the very few people who wanted to integrate the two. And we need and still need more of those people who know both the genetics work and evolutionary psychology work. And so David Rowe is a pioneer in that. So that's, and I'm very sorry he's died much too soon. Yeah.
And last, how about Margot Wilson?
Margot was one of the sweetest people in the world. I mean, she really was. Everybody loved her, and she was indescribably wonderful. So I've known her since, I guess it was, I want to say 83 or 84, whenever Martin and Margot came to Harvard for their sabbatical. That's when I met her and Martin. And I had one interesting interaction with her that I had a number of interesting interactions. I'll mention one, and that is that when Josh Duntley and I first presented at HBES a long time ago, I think it was '98, our theory of evolved homicide adaptations. It's a theory that goes against Daly and Wilson's view that homicides are byproducts of other mechanisms and are not adaptations in their own right. And so I wanted to get their reactions, Martin and Margot's reactions, and I remember talking to her after a couple years, because their first reaction was absolutely not, it's all byproduct. But I remember talking to Margot, just she and I, and she said, David, in thinking about it, I think, maybe infanticide. I'll give you infanticide, but not the others. So she was willing to, she was open-minded enough to, to entertain that view, even though she and Martin had basically, their view had been, and as far as I know still is, at least in published literature, that infanticide is a byproduct, and that there aren't, unlike many other species where you have known infanticide, like lions, that 25% of the cubs die by being killed by males. You find similar phenomena in humans, and also female committed infanticide when a kid comes out with a birth defect,
Sure.
or female's not in a resource position to raise a kid. So Margot was willing to at least entertain the notion that maybe there are some homicide adaptations in humans, at least in that restricted sphere. So I will always remember her with tremendous fondness, both personally and intellectually.
David, thank you for letting me pull you away from some talks here at HBES, for mentoring me in grad school, and for what you've done for the field. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Barry. That's wonderful chatting.
Thank you.